The Rise and Fall of Getting Things Done: How Personal Productivity Transformed Work and Failed to, by Cal Newport, November 17, 2020. As the obligations of knowledge work have grown increasingly frenetic, workers have flocked to productivity tools and techniques. In the early 2000s, Merlin Mann, a web designer and avowed Macintosh enthusiast, was working as a freelance project manager for software companies. He had held similar roles for years, so he knew the ins and outs of the job. He was surprised, therefore, to find that he was overwhelmed, not by the intellectual aspects of his work, but by the many small administrative tasks, such as scheduling conference calls, that bubbled up from a turbulent stream of email messages. "I was in this batting cage, deluged with information," he told me recently. "I went to college. I was smart. Why was I having such a hard time?" Mann wasn't alone in his frustration. In the 1990s, the spread of email had transformed knowledge work. With nearly all friction removed from professional communication, anyone could bother anyone else at any time. Many emails brought obligations: to answer a question, look into a lead, arrange a meeting, or provide feedback. Work lives that had once been sequential, 2 or 3 blocks of work broken up by meetings and phone calls, became frantic, improvisational, and impossibly overloaded. "Email is a ball of uncertainty that represents anxiety," end quote, Mann said, reflecting on this period. In 2003, he came across a book that seemed to address his frustrations. It was titled Getting Things Done: The Art of Stress-Free Productivity, and for Mann, it changed everything. The time management system described called GTD had been developed by David Allen, a consultant turned entrepreneur who lived in the crunchy mountain town of Ojai, California. Allen combined ideas from Zen Buddhism with the strict organizational techniques he'd honed while advising corporate clients. He proposed a theory about how our minds work. When we try to keep track of obligations in our heads, we create open loops that make us anxious. That anxiety, in turn, reduces our ability to think effectively. If we could avoid worrying about what we were supposed to be doing, we could focus more fully on what we were actually doing, achieving what Allen called a mind like water. To maintain such a mind, one must deal with new obligations before they can become entrenched as open loops. GTD's solution is a multi-step system. It begins with what Allen describes as full capture. The idea is to maintain a set of inboxes into which you can drop obligations as soon as they arise. One such inbox might be a physical tray on your desk. When you suddenly remember that you need to finish a task before an upcoming meeting, you can jot a reminder on a piece of paper, toss it in the tray, and without breaking concentration, return to whatever it was you were doing. Throughout the day, you might add similar thoughts to other inboxes, such as a list on your computer or a pocket notebook. But jotting down notes isn't, in itself, enough to close the loops. Your mind must trust that you will return to your inboxes and process what's inside them. Allen calls this final, crucial step regular review. During reviews, you transform your haphazard reminders into concrete next actions, then enter them onto a master list. This list can now provide a motive force for your efforts. In his book, Allen recommends organizing the master list into contexts such as phone or at computer. Moving through the day, you can simply look at the tasks listed under your current context and execute them one after another. Allen uses the analogy of cranking widgets to describe his calmly mechanical approach to work. It's a rigorous system for the generation of serenity. To someone with Mann's engineering sensibility, the precision of GTD was appealing, and the method itself seemed ripe for optimization. In September 2004, Mann started a blog called 43 Folders, a reference to an organizational hack, the tickler file, described in Allen's book. In an introductory post, Mann wrote, "Believe me, quote, believe me, if you keep finding that the water of your life has somehow run onto the floor, GTD may be just the drinking glass you need to get things back together." End quote. He published 9 posts about GTD during the blog's first month. The discussion was often highly technical. In one post, he proposed the creation of a unified XML format for GTD data, which would allow different apps to display the same tasks in multiple formats, including, quote, graphical map, outline, RDF, structured text, end quote. He told me that the writer Cory Doctorow linked to an early 43 folders post on Doctorow's popular nerd culture site Boing Boing. Traffic surged. Mann soon announced that in just 30 days, 43 folders had received over 150,000 unique visitors. Quote, "That's just nuts," end quote, he wrote. The site became so popular that Mann quit his job to work on it full-time. As his influence grew, he popularized a new term for the genre that he was helping to create: productivity porn, an adaptation of the leet speak, or geek lingo, word for pornography. The hunger for this porn, or prawn, he noticed, was insatiable. People were desperate to tinker with their productivity systems. What Mann and his fellow enthusiasts were doing felt perfectly natural. They were trying to be more productive in a knowledge work environment that seemed increasingly frenetic and hard to control. What they didn't realize was that they were reacting to a profound shift in the workplace that had gone largely unnoticed. Before there was personal productivity, there was just productivity, a measure of how much a worker could produce in a fixed interval of time. At the turn of the 20th century, Frederick Taylor and his acolytes had studied the physical movements of factory workers, looking for places to save time and reduce costs. It wasn't immediately obvious how this industrial concept of productivity might be adapted from the assembly line to the office. A major figure in this translation was Peter Drucker, the influential business scholar who is widely regarded as the creator of modern management theory. Drucker was born in Austria in 1909. His parents, Adolf and Caroline, held evening salons that were attended by Friedrich Hayek and Joseph Schumpeter, among other economic luminaries. The intellectual energy of these salons seemed to inspire Drucker's own productivity. He wrote 39 books, the last shortly before his death, at the age of 95. His career took off after the publication of his second book, The Future of Industrial Man, in 1942, when he was a 33-year-old professor at Bennington College. The book asked how an industrial society, one unfolding within the entirely new physical reality which Western man has created as his habitat since James Watt invented the steam engine, might be structured to respect human freedom and dignity. Arriving in the midst of an industrial world war, the book found a wide audience. After reading it, the management team at General Motors invited Drucker to spend 2 years studying the operations of what was then the world's largest corporation. The 1946 book that resulted from that engagement, Concept of the Corporation, was one of the first to look seriously at how big organizations actually got work done. It laid the foundation for treating management as a subject that could be studied analytically. In the 1950s, the American economy began to move from manual labor toward cognitive work. Drucker helped business leaders understand this transformation. In his 1959 book, Landmarks of Tomorrow, he coined the term knowledge work and argued that autonomy would be the central feature of the new corporate world. Drucker predicted that corporate profits would depend on mental effort and that each individual knowledge worker, possessing skills too specialized to be broken down into repetitive, simple mechanical motions, choreographed from above, would need to decide how to apply his knowledge as a professional and monitor his own productivity. The knowledge worker cannot be supervised closely or in detail, Drucker wrote in The Effective Executive from 1967. He must direct himself. Drucker's emphasis on the autonomy of knowledge workers made sense, as there was no obvious way to deconstruct the efforts required by newly important mid-century jobs like corporate research and development or advertisement copywriting into assembly line style sequences of optimized steps. But Drucker was also influenced by the politics of the Cold War. He viewed creativity and innovation as key to staying ahead of the Soviets. Citing the invention of the atomic bomb, he argued that scientific work of such complexity and ambiguity could not have been managed using the heavy-handed techniques of the industrial age, which he likened to the centralized planning of the Soviet economy. Future industries, he suggested, would need to operate in local and decentralized ways. To support his emphasis on knowledge worker autonomy, Drucker introduced the idea of management by objectives, a process in which managers focus on setting out clear targets, but the details of how they're accomplished are left to individuals. This idea is both extremely consequential and rarely debated. It's why the modern office worker is inundated with quantified quarterly goals and motivating mission statements, but receives almost no guidance on how to actually organize and manage these efforts. It was thus largely owing to Drucker that in 2004, when Merlin Mann found himself overwhelmed by his work, he took it for granted that the solution to his woes would be found in the optimization of his personal habits. As the popularity of 43 folders grew, so did Mann's influence in the online productivity world. One breakthrough from this period was a novel organizational device that he called the hipster PDA. Pre-smartphone handheld devices such as the Palm Pilot were often described as personal digital assistants. The hipster PDA was proudly analog. The instructions for making one were aggressively simple. Get a bunch of 3x5-inch index cards. 2. Clip them together with a binder clip. 3. There is no step 3. The device Mann suggested was ideal for implementing GTD. The top index card could serve as an inbox where tasks could be jotted down for subsequent processing, while colored cards in the stack could act as dividers to organize tasks by project or context. A 2005 article in Globe and Mail noted that Ian Capstick, a press secretary for Canada's new Democratic Party, wielded a hipster PDA in place of a BlackBerry. Just as GTD was achieving widespread popularity, however, Mann's zeal for his own practice began to fade. An inflection point in his writing came in 2007, soon after he gave a GTD-inspired speech about email management to an overflow audience at Google's Mountain View headquarters. Building on the classic productivity idea that an office worker shouldn't touch the same piece of paper more than once, Mann outlined a new method for rapidly processing emails. In this system, you would read each email only once, then select from a limited set of options, delete it, respond to it, defer it, by moving it into a folder of messages requiring long responses, delegate it, or do it, by extracting and executing the activity at its core, or capturing it for later attention in a system like GTD. The goal was to apply these rules mechanically until your digital message pile was empty. Mann called his strategy Inbox Zero. After Google uploaded a video of his talk to YouTube, the term entered the vernacular. Editors began inquiring about book deals. Not long afterward, Mann posted a self-reflective essay on 43 folders in which he revealed a growing dissatisfaction with the world of personal productivity. Productivity prawn, he suggested, was becoming a bewildering, complexifying, end in itself. List making as a cargo cult, system tweaking as an addiction. On more than a few days, I wondered what precisely I was trying to accomplish, he wrote. Part of the problem was the recursive quality of his work. Refining his productivity system so that he could blog more efficiently about productivity made him feel as if he were being, quote, tossed around by a menacing Rube Goldberg device, end quote, of his own design. At times, he said, quote, I thought I might be losing my mind, end quote. He also wondered whether, on a substantive level, the approach that he'd been following was really capable of addressing his frustrations. It seemed to him that it was possible to implement many GTD-inflected life hacks without feeling, quote, more competent, stable, and alive, end quote. He cleaned house, deleting posts. A new About page explained that 43 folders was no longer a productivity blog, but a website about finding the time and attention to do your best creative work. Mann's posting slowed. In 2011, after a couple years of desultory writing, he published a valedictory essay titled Cranking, a rumination on an illness of his father's, and a description of his own struggle to write a book about inbox zero after becoming disenchanted with personal productivity as a concept. Quote, I'd type and I'd type. I'd crank and I'd crank, he recounted. I'm done cranking, and I'm ready to make change, end quote. After noting that his editor would likely cancel his book contract, he concluded with a bittersweet sign-off, quote, thanks for listening, nerds, end quote. There have been no posts on his site for the past 9 years. I'm going to take a little break and look up the definition of
desultory.
Desultory. Lacking a plan, purpose, or enthusiasm. And valedictory. Valedictory. Serving as a farewell. Continuing on. Even after the loss of one of its leaders, the productivity porn movement continued to thrive because the overload culture that had inspired it continued to worsen. GTD was joined by numerous other attempts to tame excessive work obligations, from the bullet journal method to the explosion in smartphone-based productivity apps to my own contribution to the movement, a call to emphasize deep work over shallow. But none of these responses solve the underlying problem. The knowledge sector's insistence that productivity is a personal issue seems to have created a so-called, quote, tragedy of the commons, end quote, scenario, in which individuals making reasonable decisions for themselves ensure a negative group outcome. An office worker's life is dramatically easier in the moment if she can send messages that demand immediate responses from her colleagues, or disseminate requests and tasks to others in an ad hoc manner. But the cumulative effect of such constant, unstructured communication is cognitively harmful. On the receiving end, the deluge of information and demands makes work unmanageable. There's little that any one individual can do to fix the problem. A worker might send fewer email requests to others and become more structured about her work, but she'll still receive requests from everyone else. Meanwhile, if she decides to decrease the amount of time that she spends engaging with this harried digital din, she slows down other people's work, creating frustration. In this context, the shortcomings of personal productivity systems like GTD become clear. They don't directly address the fundamental problem, the insidiously haphazard way that work unfolds at the organizational level. They only help individuals cope with its effects. A highly optimized implementation of GTD might have helped Mann organize the hundreds of tasks that arrived haphazardly in his inbox daily, but it could do nothing to reduce the quantity of these requests. There are ways to fix the destructive effects of overload culture, but such solutions would have to begin with a re-evaluation of Peter Drucker's insistence on knowledge worker autonomy. Productivity, we must recognize, can never be entirely personal. It must be connected to a system that we can study, analyze, and improve. One of the few academics who has seriously explored knowledge work productivity in recent years is Tom Davenport, a professor of information technology and management at Babson College. Many organizations claim to be interested in productivity, he told me, but they almost always pursue it by introducing new technology tools, spreadsheets, network applications, web-based collaboration software, in piecemeal fashion. The general belief is that knowledge workers will never stand for intrusions into the autonomy they've come to expect. The idea of large-scale interventions that might replace the mess of unstructured messaging with a more structured set of procedures is rarely considered. Although Davenport's 2005 book, Thinking for a Living, attempted to offer concrete advice about how the knowledge worker productivity might be improved, in many places his advice is constrained by the assumed inviolability. Oh man, one sec, let me look that one up.
Inviolable.
Inviolable. Prohibiting violation secured from destruction, violence, infringement, or desecration.
Inviolable.
Inviolable. Constrained by the assumed inviolability of autonomy. In one chapter, for example, he explores the possibility of routinizing or constraining the tasks of transaction workers who perform similar duties over and over by using a diagram to communicate an optimal sequence of actions. He adds, however, that such routinization simply won't appeal to expert workers, who he says are unlikely to pay attention to elaborate flowcharts suggesting when they should collaborate and when they should leave each other alone. In the end, Thinking for a Living failed to find an audience. Quote, "It was one of my worst-selling books," end quote, Davenport said. He soon shifted his attention to more popular topics, such as big data and artificial intelligence. And yet, even if we accept that people don't want to be micromanaged, it doesn't follow that every single aspect of knowledge work must be left to the individual. If I'm a computer programmer, I might not want my project manager telling me how to solve a coding problem, but I would welcome clear-cut rules that limit the ability of other divisions to rope me into endless meetings or demand responses to never-ending urgent messages. The benefits of top-down interventions designed to protect both attention and autonomy could be significant. In an article published in 1999, Drucker noted that, in the course of the 20th century, the productivity of the average manual laborer had increased by a factor of 50, the result in large part of an obsessive focus on how to conduct this work more effectively. By some estimates, knowledge workers in North America outnumber manual workers by close to 4 to 1, and yet, as Drucker wrote, work on the productivity of the knowledge worker has barely begun, end quote. Fittingly, we can derive a clear vision of a more productive future by returning to Merlin Mann. In the final years of 43 Folders, Mann began dabbling in podcasting. After shuttering his website, he turned his attention more fully toward this emerging medium. Mann now hosts 4 regular podcasts. One show, quote, Roderick on the Line, end quote, consists of an unfiltered conversation with Mann's friend, John Roderick, the lead singer of the band The Long Winters. Another show, Back to Work, tackles productivity, mixing some early 43 Folders style exploration of digital tools with late 43 folder style digressions on the purpose of productivity. A recent episode of Back to Work combined a technical conversation about TaskPaper, a plain text to-do list software for Macs, with a metaphysical discussion about disruptions. Mann no longer uses the full GTD system. He remains a fan of David Allen. There's a person for whom GTD is a perfect fit, end quote, he told me. But the nature of his current work doesn't generate the overwhelming load of obligations that first drove him to the system back in 2004. Quote, "My needs are very modest from a task management perspective," he said. "I have a production schedule for the podcasts. It's that and grocery lists," end quote. He does still use some big ideas from GTD, such as deploying calendar notifications to remind him to water his plants and clean his cat's litter box. Quote, "Why would I let that take up any part of my brain?" End quote. However, his day is now structured in such a way that he can spend most of his time focused on the autonomous, creative, skilled work that Drucker identified as so crucial to growing our economy. Most of us are not our own bosses and therefore lack the ability to drastically overhaul the structure of work obligations. But in Mann's current setup, there's a glimpse of what might help. Imagine if, through some combination of new management thinking and technology, we could introduce processes that minimize the time required to talk about work or fight off random tasks flung our way by equally harried coworkers, and instead let us organize our days around a small number of discrete objectives. A way, that is, to preserve Drucker's essential autonomy while sidestepping the uncontrollable overload that his autonomy can accidentally trigger. This vision is appealing, but it cannot be realized by individual actions alone. It will require management intervention. Up until now, there has been little will to instigate this shift in responsibility for productivity from the person to the organization. As Davenport discovered, most knowledge work companies have been more focused on keeping up with technological breakthroughs that might open up new markets. To get more done, it's been sufficient to simply exhort employees to work harder. Laptops and smartphones help these efforts by enabling office workers to find extra hours in the day to get things done, providing a productivity counterbalance to the inefficiencies of overload culture. And then COVID-19 arrived. In a remarkably short span, the spread of the coronavirus shut down offices around the world. In a remarkably short span, the spread of coronavirus shut down offices around the world. This unexpected change amplified the inefficiencies latent in our haphazard approach to work. Many individuals responded by immersing themselves in a 43-folder style world of productivity hacks. As we attempt to juggle percolating crises, endless Zoom calls, and for many, the requirement to somehow integrate both childcare and homeschooling into the same hours, there's a sudden urgent need to carefully organize tasks and intricately synchronize schedules. But it's becoming clear that, as Mann learned, individual efforts are not enough. Although offices are now partially reopening, a significant amount of work will, for the foreseeable future, continue to be performed remotely. To survive the current crisis, knowledge work companies may finally be forced to move past Drucker's insistent autonomy and begin asking hard questions about how their work is actually accomplished. It seems likely that any successful effort to reform professional life must start by making it easier to figure out who is working on what and how it's going. Because so much of our effort is now in the office now unfolds in rapid exchanges of digital messages, it's convenient to allow our inboxes to become an informal repository for everything we need to get done. This strategy, however, obscures many of the worst aspects of overload culture. When I don't know how much is currently on your plate, it's easy for me to add one more thing. When I cannot see what my team is up to, I can allow accidental inequities to rise, in which the willing end up overloaded and the unwilling remain happily unbothered. For instance, in field tests led by Linda Babcock of Carnegie Mellon University, women were found to take a disproportionate load of non-promotable service tasks, such as organizing office parties, and to be more likely than men to say yes when asked to do so, leading to their being asked more often. Consider instead a system that externalizes work. Following the lead of software developers, we might use virtual task boards where every task is represented by a card that specifies who is doing the work and is pinned under a column indicating its status. With a quick glance, you can now ascertain everything going on within your team and ask meaningful questions about how much work any one person should tackle at a time. With this setup, optimization becomes possible. In software development, for example, it's widely accepted that programmers are most effective when they work on one feature at a time, focusing on distraction-free sprint until done. It's conceivable that other knowledge fields might enjoy similar productivity boosts from more intentional assignments of effort. What if you began each morning with a status meeting in which your team confronts its task board? A plan could then be made about which handful of things each person would tackle that day. Instead of individuals feeling besieged and resentful about the additional tasks that similarly overwhelmed colleagues are flinging their way, they could execute a collaborative plan designed to benefit everyone. The ability to better visualize work would also enable smarter processes. If you notice that the influx of administrative demands from other parts of your company is overwhelming you and your coworkers, you're now motivated to seek fixes. Such optimizations are unlikely to occur when the scope of the problem is hidden among inbox detritus and when productivity is still understood as a matter of personal will.
Detritus.
Detritus, waste or debris of any kind. Whether or not coronavirus-driven disruption provides the final push we need to move away from our flawed commitment to personal productivity, we can be certain that this transition will eventually happen. Even if we convince ourselves that the psychological toll of overload culture is acceptable collateral damage for a fast-paced modern world, there's too much latent economic value at stake to keep ignoring the haphazard nature of how we currently work. It's ironic that Drucker, the very person who extolled the potential of knowledge worker productivity, helped plant the ideas that have since held it back. To move forward, we must step away from Drucker's commitment to total autonomy, allowing for freedom in how we execute tasks without also allowing for chaos in how these tasks are assigned. We must, in other words, acknowledge the futility of trying to tame our frenzied work lives all on our own, and instead ask collectively whether there's a better way to get things done. Cal Newport is a professor of computer science at Georgetown University. Well, that's the end of the article. I will just make one comment. I am a software developer, and I'm very familiar with these task boards. And I still think there is a problem with project managers expecting that I can accurately predict the time that a task will take to complete. So I'll get a task to implement or modify a piece of software, and that task will be broken up into things like planning and step 1, step 2, step 3, which I think gives an illusion that it is well planned, when the reality is that I don't know how long these tasks are going to take, and I have to investigate the task um, to get a semi-accurate idea of how long it's going to take. So, it just seems like a lot of wasted time to me. I'll investigate a task to create another planning task, and then, maybe someone will ask me why the planning task took less or longer, and it seems like there's still a lot of wasted time in our attempt to not waste time. And to a certain degree, I think, just give me a task and I will let you know when it's done. But that I guess that comes with its own set of problems, and project managers tend not to like that approach very much. Okay, thanks for listening.